Well, since Easter, we have been following the beginnings of the church in the book of Acts. And I think our scriptures today are there to remind us that compassion is something that we learn in community. Now, last week, Saul, who we have come to know as Paul, was overseeing the murder of Stephen by an angry crowd. And we are told then that he continued to hunt down and arrest all of the followers of Jesus that he could find. We're not sure if he was an official representative of the government or a vigilante appointed sheriff. Now, we've been reading these stories with trauma in mind. And I think Paul is one of those people who didn't flee or freeze from his trauma. His response was to fight. Seems Paul had been taught that, well, he had the only one right understanding of God, and this was a God who wanted obedience and who required vengeance. And at this point in his personal life, his identity was deeply invested in this belief system. Now, the followers of Jesus, that disgraced rabbi who died a criminal's death, they were a threat to his entire worldview. Not to mention, they were weak. They didn't even fight back, and Saul was determined to eradicate them. So how does someone go from seeking to destroy a group of marginalized people to calmly supporting them and actually becoming one of them? How does one overcome a lifetime of oppression and that resulting trauma that motivates individuals and groups to lash out, projecting and misdirecting their pain and anger onto other people, people who won't or can't defend themselves? I think it takes more than a rational conversation or even a heated argument to bring about this kind of change in a person. So if we go back maybe a few chapters, we begin to see a series of events that prove to be therapeutic and transformative for this one angry, vengeful person. Saul's transformation begins on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus when he saw a light so bright that it knocked him to the ground and blinded him, and he heard a voice claiming to be Jesus that told him to go on to the city and just wait. So he waits in his own darkness with no food or water for 3 days. And in Damascus, Ananias, a follower of Jesus, also experiences a vision with a message instructing him to go to find where Saul is. And if he will go and approach and touch this dangerous enemy, this person known for killing his friends, well, then Saul will be able to see again. Now, we might also consider that today we also read some of Jesus' last instructions that he gave to his followers, where he said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." And we can skim through the Gospels and see that, well, the one commandment that he gave was to love one another and to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And he made sure to point out that your neighbor includes your enemy. So it's not surprising to us that Ananias would hear this message, this call to go and heal this person, this enemy who could kill you once he's well. And Ananias was afraid, and yet he faced his fears, and he offered help rather than retribution. And he found Saul, and he touched him, and he offered food and shelter and companionship and took care of him in the days ahead. So we can try to imagine this person, Saul, who had always been strong and strong-willed and competent, is now physically dependent on others and unsure of what he thought he knew about God and life and right and wrong. Now he is the recipient of unexpected grace. These people that he was determined to harm are taking care of him, and they're providing for his needs. And their faith in God, who loves unconditionally, is expressed not just in words and descriptions, but in physical actions of caring. Being welcomed into this community is a life-changing experience, and he begins to learn what compassion really looks like. Now, Dr. Kelly McGonigal is one of the creators of Stanford University's Compassion Cultivation Training Program. You probably didn't know they had one, but they do. And she studies how people tend to grow to become more compassionate. She observed people going through what seems to be a 6-step process to developing compassion. And we tend to think it's something you have or you don't have, and they're realizing more and more it is something that grows and we develop. So it begins first with awareness of suffering. And again, we don't realize that is an intentional skill. Are you able to notice the suffering in others? Because we can often experience compassion blindness and just not see what's happening in the lives of others. The second step in this growth and this development is just connection and empathy, developing that ability to take the perspective of others, to strengthen that sense of common humanity and have a basic benevolent wish for the others to be happy. And then we step to finding motivation to relieve that suffering. And this is a transformation of that stress response of fear. We tend to be uncomfortable with other people's pain, and we have to overcome that discomfort of our own in order to want to help, to develop a caregiving instinct. And then we move to the point of self-efficacy, the realization that we can do something, that we could help. We often begin to realize, she says, that the one thing we can do is just be a compassionate presence. What happens when you just don't disappear, when you are willing to listen or stay with the person? And then the next step is choosing how to respond once we have come through this and developed this, and what is it we can help, and then doing that thing that we are able to do to reach out and help where we see suffering and pain. And then finally, there is just that joy that comes from the full experience of social connection, this recognition that just like me, these are people who want to be happy and want to be free from suffering, and in that way, we are the same, and we're in this together. And we tend to think everybody learned that in childhood, and yet we realize this is not true. Often, childhoods were traumatized and lacking that kind of development, and it can come at any time in life. So I think the story that we've read today is one example of this transformation of learning compassion that is playing out in the life of Saul, who we come to know as the Apostle Paul. So in our reading today, we've picked up his story, and he's in Athens. He's visiting the heart of the Greek culture. And Karen Armstrong describes the magnitude of this encounter. This is more important and surprising than we might think. For Paul had always chosen to live in the Holy Lands because the Gentile world was considered unclean. The Jewish community at the time tended to regard non-Jewish nations as being impure and places they needed to avoid. But now Paul has learned that in the raising of Jesus, God has shown that he did not judge by these earthly standards. They stood by people who were despised and denigrated by the rules and laws of the world. He's come to realize that God has no favorites. So now in Athens, he's invited to the Areopagus, the place where local leaders gather and they discuss their social issues, their philosophy, their politics. Now he's in a place where he can't assume the same backgrounds or the same information. Here he would need to take some time to get to know them, to get to know their assumptions about what gives life meaning and where God fits into that. So he starts with an honest compliment. He's pointing out something they have in common. As he says, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I have walked through the city, I look carefully at the objects of your worship. And here he's not baiting them. He's really admiring their pursuit of divine knowledge, their quest for a deeper understanding of truth. There's no words of judgment here, no expressions of superiority or disgust, but rather recognizing the value of their spiritual practices, respecting their culture, beginning to understand their context, he's able to find a way to open genuine conversation. And we notice how he affirms our common humanity and God's love for everyone. He says, now I see that the God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, is not served by human hands as though God needed anything, since it is the true God who gives to all mortals life and breath and all things, things he could not have said before. He continues this open-minded explanation. From one ancestor, God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. God allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries for the places where they would live, so that all might search for God and perhaps reach and seek and find. For it doesn't matter where you're born or what tribe or nation you are part of, God is close to each one of us. Paul is affirming their history and their artist, saying, in God we live and move and have our being. Even as some of your own poets have said, we too are the offspring of God. The revelation of God is now open and everywhere in the world where we are seeking. Paul had learned through his experience that personal experience is a reliable source of revelation. So he urged the Athenians to listen to their poets who experience and describe the nearness of this one, maybe yet unnamed God. And after listening and learning, Paul affirms that he believed that God has made the world and everything and everyone in it. He has learned compassion at this point in his life. He's realizing that every single person was God's offspring. There is no person, no nation, no sphere of influence that is outside of God's concern. All of so-called secular life, not just sacred spaces, are the spheres of God's love and presence. So now, Paul is able to view Greece as another place where the Lord of all creation is gone before, is already present, and we are finding where God is at work. So he looked for the Spirit of God at work wherever people were sharing ideas, seeking peaceful resolutions to conflict. This person who was once willing to kill for his version of faith is now sharing that faith with all people, no longer resulting in violence. For Paul, this open, all-loving view of God was the result of having learned compassion in community. This is essential to our understanding as well. In our century, God does not live just in shrines made by human hands, not only in churches built by those who claim to be Christian. For the God in whom we live and move and have our being is everywhere around us, already at work, drawing the hearts of people to hope and faith and love. So maybe today, as well as followers of Jesus, what we need to do is walk alongside those who are seeking truth, to listen to one another's stories, to one another's needs and hopes. We need to listen for what we do already have in common, what passions ignite the hearts of those around us and resonate with us, and then inviting them into this caring community, letting them know that the Spirit of God is still at work in this world, in our century, wherever compassion is learned and shared. And now let's continue to worship this God of love in song.